Hello and welcome to another episode of the CMT podcast. This is episode
12.
12. Yeah, I'm Aubrey going.
And I'm Alison Kavanagh.
So we have a couple of different things we're going to discuss today. I think the main topic was stretching.
Stretching,
Yeah.
yes, the importance of stretching, especially for our clients to maintain the benefits of treatment.
Yep. Sorry, I'm playing around with technology here a little bit. Um,
And we were even going to look at some of the naming and of terminology that's used within our industry and how that can sometimes create confusion and misunderstandings.
yes, yeah, some nice kind of social media stuff we were looking at in the last little while that is worth chatting about, just purely for the purposes of illumination and clarity and things like that. So will we start off with stretching?
Yeah,
Yeah. So I think stretching is something that I've always been a big fan of. We do always say that, stretching is one part of the rehab process because largely when we're dealing with dysfunction, it's that some muscles have become habitually short and tight. And then we know because of how the nervous system coordinates between muscles, their opposite becomes weak and inhibited. And it's oftentimes those weak muscles that become painful. So, really, to start the process of bringing us back towards good function, we should be stretching tight muscles first
yes.
rather than addressing the symptomatic or potentially painful muscles.
hmm
But I think the problem is for a lot of people when they go to stretch, they're not really necessarily getting the benefits out because how you stretch is nearly as important as what you stretch.
Yes.
So what we're going to cover really here is the golden rules of stretching. There's a couple of simple principles that if you apply them, it actually doesn't matter which muscle you're stretching. Same thing is going to apply. You're going to go through the same process. One of the things I've really noticed is people tend to conflate, meaning they kind of confuse the lengthening of a muscle with actually stretching. Maybe we'll start at a better point, maybe to talk about what is the purpose of stretching, because people might stretch, but they're not really clear on which muscles. Like typical muscle imbalance, we'd say quads tend to be tight and hamstrings tend to be weak.
hmm
That's going to be pretty universal,
hmm
unless you're doing something really unusual that you're really working your hamstrings strong, or you're doing a lot of work in the gym that specifically targets the hamstrings, something like that,
Yeah.
or a given sport that might involve a lot of hip extension. I don't know. But typically, we'd say quads are going to be tight and hamstrings are going to be weak and inhibited. And people feel that as a tension in the hamstrings because they're overstretched.
hmm
And they'll tend to stretch their quads and their hamstrings. And you're going, well, no, you really should be stretching your quads.
hmm
And the purpose is to restore normal resting length.
Yeah.
So another good example of this might be something like the bicep, where we tend to have our elbows bent a lot, either because we're on a device or we're operating a computer or we're operating machinery, we're driving a lot, or we're at a desk or doing some arm intensive activity like hairdressing or working in the trades if you're operating tools or things like that. We are just keep our elbows flexed an awful lot. So I think there's two components to the dysfunction. One is fascial and the other is neurological.
hmm
And I think both are compounded by habit. So we would say that if you're not lengthening a muscle enough, you're not requiring the individual fascial sheaths to slide fully against each other.
hmm
And so they get stuck in that shortened position and we lose full resting length.
hmm
But the other thing is the nervous system becomes adapted and thinks that this is normal. The example I always give of this is like a great way to lose weight would be when you stand on the bathroom scales, before you step on it, set it to -3. And then you've lost 3 pounds or kilos or whatever you want. It doesn't work because the reality is the same, but you have miscalibrated. And I think that's what happens to the nervous system because the muscle is constantly in a shortened position. It gets so used to thinking this is neutral, it has miscalibrated and it doesn't really have a feel for where full resting length should be. So the purpose is when muscles have become shortened, the purpose of stretching is to restore normal resting length.
hmm
And I think because there's such a focus on stretching to increase range of motion, kind of like dynamic increases for particular demands, like say a gymnast or something that might want to go way beyond what would be considered normal ranges of motion, that you think about stretching as for developing greater flexibility,
hmm
but it's not. There is developmental stretching for that, but typically when we're stretching, it's to get a habitually tight muscle to just go back to its normal resting length.
hmm
So I think that's pretty simple.
Yeah.
Purpose of stretching is to restore normal resting length. So like I said, fascia tends to get stuck if we don't lengthen the muscle very often, and the nervous system adapts to that. And then we become kind of stuck like that. then the opposing signal is sent to the opposite muscle. If the bicep is being told to shorten to increase its tone, the tricep is being told to relax and decrease its tone.
Mm-hmm.
And so it becomes weak and inhibited.
Mm-hmm.
Well clear on that so far?
Yeah.
Anything to add?
Yeah. I just think it's stretching. People think it has to hurt, or I need to feel a strong stretch.
Yeah.
Uh, and I see a lot of videos on social media, and they're actually doing strengthening exercises, and they're calling it a stretch. And I'm kind of going, wait a minute.
Yeah, we saw one recently where the guy was using a kettlebell and he was doing a very specific movement across the body and all this kind of stuff. And oh, this is a great way to stretch your hamstrings. And it's like, not only is gravity acting on your body weight, meaning the hamstring, because he was standing on one leg, I think,
Yeah.
meaning those hamstrings really have to contract. But then you're adding
Wait.
additional weight by carrying a kettlebell. And that's what I mean about confusing lengthening with actually stretching.
Yeah.
That, yeah, you're lengthening your hamstrings and then you're creating load in a lengthened position. So you'll feel a lot of pressure in the hamstring.
Yeah.
And people then think, oh, that's a good stretch.
Stretch, and they don't realize it should be done without load. It should be passive,
Yeah,
like to really relax into a stretch.
yeah,
And I think that's why yoga and so on is so popular, because um, you're able to relax and hold a particular asana or pose,
mm,
and it just allows gravity to take effect to gently lengthen muscles.
yeah, yeah. I would always say again, the focus in yoga is different
Hmm.
than in just pure like rehab type stretching
Yeah.
or stretching to restore normal resting length. Because oftentimes we have yogis in the room and they'll go, but what about when I do a pose? Well, there's a different purpose there.
Yeah.
But if we're talking purely about stretching to restore normal resting length, which
Yeah.
in therapies and for most clients and for most people around the world, I mean, everybody has a body,
Hmm.
and almost everybody, I'd say 99.999% of people, have some muscles that are going to be a little bit shorter than they should be and aren't really returning to normal resting length
Yeah.
because they're a little bit stuck or the nervous system habit or both.
Hmm.
So, our golden rules of stretching, I would say that really it should be non weight bearing.
Yes.
So if you are stretching your hamstrings, probably there's a lot of different positions you could do this in, but one of the best positions is lying on your back and you raise the leg up. That you're not standing. Most people would do like try to touch their toes, which is lengthening,
Hmm.
but there's the weight of the body.
Hmm.
So it's not really truly passive.
Hmm.
So it shouldn't be weight bearing so that the muscle can actually relax as it lengthens
Hmm.
rather than being tensing. Another thing that will help is if you contract the opposing muscle.
Yeah. Use
So
the
if you're trying
nervous
to,
system.
yeah, if you're trying to stretch your bicep and you're lengthening it out, if you're actually contracting the muscles in the back of the shoulder to lengthen the bicep, then the nervous system is now doing the opposite. It's telling the normally weak tricep to contract, which will be sending a relaxation signal to the bicep.
Hmm.
So if you contract the opposing muscle to the one you're trying to stretch, you'll actually get a better relaxation or reduction in tone through this process of reciprocal innervation or reciprocal inhibition. In this case, we're talking about inhibition.
Yes, post isometric relaxation.
Yeah. So the muscle that you're trying to stretch should not be weight bearing. There shouldn't be excessive load. You should be contracting the antagonistic muscle. You should have a mild stretch because you will feel a little bit of that kind of connective tissue pull.
Yeah.
Some of that fascial bonds kind of unwinding and releasing,
Hmm.
some of that kind of viscoelastic response taking place as the fascia really settles into that lengthened position, the
Hmm.
muscle fascia, the myofascia. Um, if you're feeling a strong stretch, the muscle is probably resisting, as we described, like using a weight or against gravity.
Hmm.
And I think you should gently deepen the stretch as things ease. We oftentimes recommend things like these sort of stretch ropes. These are quite simple. There's oftentimes quite elaborate ones you get. These are pretty widely available. A lot of sports shops and certainly here in Europe, like places like Decathlon will carry them.
Hmm.
So you basically just have a loop. It's cotton, so important not to use a resistance band. I mean, the clue is in the name, resistance.
Hmm.
It's going to be like using a weight. Using a rubber band, whether it's one of those loops or more like the TheraBand style, those will create resistance, which means the muscle will be contracting.
Hmm.
Therefore, it ain't a stretch.
Yeah.
So a rigid structure like this, you could use a towel or a belt. These are just kind of handy because they have a loop.
Yeah.
You can oftentimes then loop that around, say like a foot or something, and we get a nice secure kind of grip, almost like a noose.
Hmm.
And then we can just apply gentle draw. Because again, if we start pulling too much, we're creating resistance. So I'd usually say if you're going to use a stretch rope, hold it between your fingers and thumbs and just very gently assisting. A good example of what I mean by gentle. When we do like a standing calf stretch, a lot of people do this kind of leaning against the wall and they push their heel into the floor.
Hmm.
The muscle starts to guard and it's too strong a stretch. So I would say do the same thing, but try to lift the toes off the ground, or trying to, you're not actually lifting the toes. So you're activating the muscles in the front of the lower leg to relax the back, which you're trying to stretch.
Mm-hmm.
And imagine when you put your foot on the ground, really kind of the ball of the foot,
Mm-hmm.
imagine you're standing on an egg.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to put the foot to the floor, but you don't want to press so heavy that you would break an egg.
Mm-hmm.
So it's that gentle a force. It's just a little assist.
Mm-hmm.
We could try this with our fingers actually. So if you're watching, you can try this. I would say to stretch your finger flexors, you would extend your fingers as far as is comfortable. You'd use the other hand. And again, imagine you're pressing on an egg here and you don't want to crack the shell. Now I can increase my range because sometimes the weak muscle can't fully lengthen the tight muscle.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the little assist comes in.
Mm-hmm.
But if the assist becomes too much, this is going to start contracting.
Mm-hmm.
So by activating my extensors, I'm relaxing my flexors, and then by gently pressing, I'm increasing the range of motion and really getting that last little bit of lengthening.
Yeah.
But I still don't feel very much here. Like that's the thing, it's very, very mild,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm not feeling a very strong stretch, but
Great
yet it is.
stretch for therapists.
Oh yeah, for therapists in particular, because we're doing so much, and musicians
Yeah.
and
And
keyboard operators.
yeah, hand dexterity.
If you're a human who uses their fingers, basically,
Yeah.
like it's pretty broad.
Yeah.
Therapists in particular, because we
Yeah.
do so much gripping.
And I think coming in and out of the stretch is really important, that you're not
Yeah,
doing sustained stretching and reducing blood flow to the muscle.
yeah. So this is another principle, and again, some people will have their own opinions on this. This is based on the work of Aaron Mattis. It's active isolated stretching, and the idea is if you go in and just hold for a second or two and then ease back out, you are allowing kind of like capillary bed refill.
Mm-hmm.
That when you stretch, you are actually compressing the capillary bed. You're mildly reducing the flow of blood through the area, but you don't really want to hold that for a long time. Some disciplines do, and you'd say, yeah, you're getting some of the benefits of stretching, but you're not really getting a fluid dynamic. You're not restricting and increasing, restricting and increasing, kind of pumping tissue fluid.
Mm-hmm.
So that could be an additional benefit that you'll get by applying that method of holding for just 2 seconds and then repeating as many times as you like.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's always a debate. Anytime we have a class, we say, how long should you hold a stretch? And we would say, typically it's going to be 2 seconds and repeat
15.
15 times. So if people in the class say, oh, you should stretch for 20 seconds, I'd say, well, do 2 second holds 10 times.
Mm-hmm.
If you say 30 seconds, 15,
Repetitions.
and you can multiply that up. Because the interesting thing about stretching is you really can't overdo it so long as you're going gently.
Mm-hmm.
You can't overdo it in terms of the number of repetitions, which is different if you were doing a strengthening exercise. Because if you overdo it, your muscles get sore, you can create inflammatory responses. You can definitely overdo it on the volume with strength work.
Yeah.
But with stretching, when it's gentle like that, it's not going to do any harm. You could do that for 5 or 10 minutes if you wanted. You would get to a point of diminishing returns. You're not getting much out of that extra investment in time, but you're not going to do any harm.
Could be repeated throughout the day.
Better still. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because it will tighten back up again.
Mm-hmm.
And the more frequently we stretch it out, the more the nervous system begins to map to that. It's like resetting that bathroom scales back to zero. The brain kind of goes, oh, this is zero.
Mm-hmm.
And then it kind of forgets and how it kicks back in. And then we start, oh, yeah, 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 yeah. And the more you do that, the more it goes, oh, this is actually normal resting length.
Yeah.
What we're trying to achieve.
Absolutely.
Okay. So what are some of the benefits then we were saying?
Well, I find with the clients that once you've freed up the tissue sufficiently, they're able to stretch more effectively and then maintain the normal resting length.
Yeah.
So it does create that window of opportunity.
Maintenance is really a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Get them to do their home care.
Because I think really that's what should happen in a good therapy session, that the client should be empowered to help themselves.
Yeah.
That we as therapists are there to nearly just free them up enough to break the sticking point, the log jam, that they're able to then do their rehab. Because sometimes, like you said, you free up the tissue first. If the tissue's too stuck, it's very slow progress. I think you would get there, but you'd want to be pretty determined.
Yeah.
You'd want to keep at it.
Yeah.
And you're definitely going to accelerate that process massively if you treat first and then do some maintenance work with some stretching.
I think telling clients that stretching actually reduces inflammation, that the pro-resolving enzyme will reduce inflammation and they'll be less sore. So where pain is a motivation, now clients will say, oh, when I was sore, I did my stretching and then I stopped because I wasn't really sore anymore.
Yeah.
But it's to be consistent and to do regular practice of the stretching. But I think once they hear, oh, this will stop my pain, it's a great motivator.
Yeah, I think we've talked about that before. That was the research done by Dr. Helene Langevin, bachelor researcher in Harvard. And she demonstrated that through stretching, you actually increase the production of pro-inflammation resolving enzymes. So it does mop up, particularly like in kind of like low level, ongoing,
Chronic pain.
chronic kind of pain. There may still be some inflammatory processes, and that will really mop that up. But even moving from the acute to the subacute phase, like from the inflammatory into the subacute, the repair phase, that you can help to speed that up by
Hmm.
gentle stretching. And again, not overdoing it, because then you might actually irritate the tissues and prolong the inflammatory process.
Hmm.
So keeping it gentle there again is going to be really important.
Yeah.
So we said it also helps with tissue hydration, because you're kind of dynamically increasing the flow of fluid, like squeezing a sponge and letting it refill and squeezing it again to clean out the dirty water that's in your sponge. If you're, doing dishes or washing windows or cleaning your car, that when you squeeze it out and you squeeze, that dynamic fluid flow really helps the tissues to get rid of their metabolites.
Yeah,
So that's
absolutely.
going to be a huge benefit. I think it's really important to think in terms of tissue hydration as well, because when layers get stuck together over time, we talk about this kind of like releasing adhesion, or what most people would think of as knots in the muscles. We talked about this back in episode 6, so you could always go back and watch episode 6 where we talk about knots in a little bit more detail. But the knot that we feel in a muscle is really just where fascia has become dehydrated, layers have begun to stick together. And this is a broader sense now. Normally when they talk about adhesion, they will mean, like, if we take a very strict medical sense,
Hmm.
we're talking about almost like scar tissue that forms after a surgical procedure.
Yes.
Those would be adhesions. Those are very common. Like
Abdominal
they do abdominal
adhesions.
adhesions. We see a lot of, yeah. Um, or like if there was a gash or something like that, if there's like a wound,
Yeah.
you will oftentimes have adhesion that is really scar tissue.
Hmm.
This is taking it in a broader sense, where we'd say adhesion is where two structures that should be separate, and we could think of this as almost like sheets within the muscle,
Hmm.
sheets of connective tissue. When those sheets, they should be separate, they should be gliding. When they get stuck together, they adhere, they glue, they're stuck.
Hmm.
So if we can unstick those through stretching by creating that mobility,
Hmm.
we are hydrating and restoring glide, which will actually help to ease out those knots. Better still if treatment has really got most of that process going, and then stretching is really just maintaining,
Hmm.
so the knots don't reform from lack of use.
But you were saying where you think of the ground substance nearly like wallpaper paste,
Mm.
and if it's left to sit, it'll go kind of hard and lumpy and dried out.
Yeah.
And that the effects of pumping, which will help to draw more fluid into the tissues, can rehydrate that ground
Yeah.
substance. And then it starts the process of getting things softened up, able to free up, and then compression, heat, movement can.
The weird thing is the fascia wants to move. Well, okay, maybe that's assigning a property it doesn't have. It doesn't want, but the ground substance in the has a molecule in it called hyaluronic acid, which
A
we've
lot of
talked about
people
before.
know from skincare now.
Yeah, yeah, it's in a lot of skincare products, because what hyaluronic acid does is, one of its functions is that it is hydrophilic, which means it draws fluid. So when I say it wants to move, once you start to get a little bit of motion into that,
Hmm.
if there's fluid in the area, the hyaluron will draw it in
Hmm.
so that it will rehydrate, like adding water into dried out wallpaper paste.
Yeah.
And you could add so much water that you dilute it to the point that it's almost flowing liquid.
Hmm.
It's hardly gel-like at all at that stage,
Yeah.
that it is more nearly like water, but it
Hmm.
does have stuff in it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just the importance of glide, because when those tissues get dehydrated, adhered, stuck together, they're not moving independently.
Mm.
But if there's nerves passing through those tissues, they can get tethered or caught, and that can start sensitizing the nerves. And then a client will tell you, I just turned to pick up a cup of tea and I put my back out, and it's like, no, no, no. This was building for a long, long time. That was the straw that broke the camel's back.
Mm.
It just was the last little pull, tug on the nerve to sensitize it and start the
Because we
pain.
talk about this in our treating trapped nerve seminar, where we'd say nerves don't stretch to the same extent as other soft tissues, so they have to be free to glide.
Hmm.
And so you might think of nerves in terms of like big nerves, like your sciatic nerve is like the thickness of your little finger.
Hmm.
But the other nerves, a lot of the little small nerves around the body, are so fine you wouldn't see them with the naked eye. Like, they're barely, not even, to call them threads is nearly overstating, because they
Hmm.
go really, really fine.
Hmm.
And if they're stuck in tissue and the tissue moves, they get pulled and actually traumatized by that. They're irritated, and then they may start triggering pain, certainly triggering the early warning stages, because we always say
Hmm.
pain is a warning sign.
Yeah.
And if there is significant enough threat,
Hmm.
the warning escalates up to the point that it impinges on our awareness and we detect it as pain.
Hmm.
Yeah. So to reduce that kind of sensitization, that irritation on the nervous system, unsticking those nerves and hydrating our fascia is going to be a huge benefit of stretching.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about how to go about stretching, we've talked about what the benefits are, and we've talked about really the primary purpose of restoring normal resting length. Anything else you want to say on that before we move on to our second topic?
I think just some people are of the mindset that everything should be strengthened,
Mm,
which you can then strengthen the muscle once it's restored its normal resting length.
yeah.
So it's just a much longer process if you're starting with a neurologically inhibited muscle,
Mm,
trying to strength train it when it's being switched off by the nervous system.
true. Yeah.
So yes, ultimately you want everything that's strong and functioning well,
Yeah.
but you may need to stretch the tight muscle
Yeah.
first.
Yeah. We've talked about this before, and actually we're going to be announcing a seminar coming up in October.
Yes,
Not
very
just yet, but we
exciting.
will have a seminar coming up where we're going to be talking about muscle imbalance,
Yeah.
exactly this topic, but also mapping out in each area of the body which muscles are prone to being tight, which muscles are prone to being weak. How can we tell the difference? And then specific exercises. How do you target each of those muscles, whether they should be stretched or whether they should be strength trained? And like we said, what we're talking about is the assumption that there is dysfunction to begin with there, because there is always some muscle imbalance, how to get back to balance, and then how to maintain that, which
Yes.
is going to be quite important. Yeah. So if you're thinking in terms of strength training something that's weak, it's going to be a long, bumpy road if you haven't dealt with what's causing that muscle to be weak.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's always what we're trying to get to, the underlying cause. Because if we deal with underlying causes, symptoms are much easier to treat
Yeah.
and we're much more successful and we have more long term sustained effect
Yeah.
rather than just a short term. You've rubbed it, so you've created some increase in circulation, you've some novel nervous system input, and it's temporary relief.
Mhm.
We're not really interested in temporary, we're interested in resolution.
Yeah, and even something like the psoas muscle, where it's getting in a short, tight position,
Mm.
and they thought for a while that real therapy didn't really impact it. It's too deep lying. It's
They, not us.
that you can't access it. Now, if there's any disorders in the area, any digestive issues,
Mm.
Crohn's, diverticulitis, irritable bowel, any of those conditions, it's important not to work directly on the tissues that are irritated or inflamed, and then you can work it indirectly through stretching. So we did a free series on our YouTube channel of stretching the essential 8 muscles. So Aubrey's explaining the stretch, I'm demonstrating it. So that's one that's worth a look if you want to know how to specifically stretch the muscles that are most typically tight.
No. We take a quick look at psoas.
Yeah.
Could actually even reach psoas.
Mm-hmm.
And I always said, yes, you can. I'm always a big advocate of working on psoas because I found it to be so beneficial myself. But what was really interesting was seeing that reel on social media recently.
Yeah.
And they put somebody in an MRI, and you can see the MRI image and then the therapist's hands. And they said, the organs slide out of the way and you can actually get down and you can contact and work psoas. And you can even see in the image how the psoas on the side they're working has slightly changed its shape from the pressure. It is deformed compared to the non-treated side.
Mm-hmm.
And they were saying that, you know, the person can get to within 9 millimeters of psoas.
Mm-hmm.
So they might have some people go, ah, see, you're not reaching it.
Mm-hmm.
But you think about it, when you're manipulating the spine, you would have to cut through a lot of muscle to press onto the bone.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, chiropractors don't do that,
Or osteopath.
or osteopaths. So they compress the soft tissue
Mm-hmm.
so that you can work through the soft tissue to move the bones.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way here, they're compressing all of the layers of soft tissue so that they can then push one layer against another to affect and treat psoas.
Yeah.
So you absolutely can. And what was really interesting in that reel was they compared it. They used two different candidates. One with they were using a BMI index, but they're basically saying somebody with a average level of body fat and then somebody with quite a high level of body fat.
Mm-hmm.
And in the second image, they showed that you can get through that soft visceral fat, or this was abdominal, wasn't visceral, abdominal fat. You can get through that and still work cellus. So it doesn't really matter what size the client is.
Yeah.
So the arguments that, oh, you can't feel it and it's too deep and all these kind of things, proven with MRI that is not the case.
Yeah.
I
Very
thought that was a
interesting.
fascinating one. Yeah. It's probably a little happy horse for me because it's something I'd always felt very strongly about. And it's just another piece of validation to show this is something that can happen. We would know this anyway from working because you can feel it as a therapist
And the results show it.
and the results show.
So once you're not working on somebody that's contraindicated for psoas work,
Mm.
it's really effective.
Yeah. And in all of our training, we do talk about what the contraindications are. So make sure you have good training if you're going to go doing that work. So moving on then to the other thing, which again was something we came across on a social media group that you were with, that you're
Yeah.
joined, yeah, a therapy group. And we were talking about really how imprecise language can really lead to a lot of confusion.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the therapists in this therapy group on Facebook went for a treatment and was told that she had lazy rhomboids. And
Lazy rhomboids with adhesion.
yes,
Yeah.
um, but I was quite interested in other people's answers as to why she was told this. Um, Lazy isn't really a technical term. If we were talking about inhibited,
Yeah.
so if we'd type pec minor, type bicep, and that was overstretching the rhomboids between the shoulder blade and the spine.
You want to take a look at rhomboids?
Yeah.
Sorry. Opposite of the dysfunctional posture we see with most people where they have a forward shoulder posture. So they have tightness in the front. Rhomboids tend to get weak. But to describe those as lazy, it's a little pejorative. It's like they could do the job and they're just not bothered.
Yeah.
So it would be more accurate to say that they have a tendency to be weak, particularly if the person had a forward shoulder posture, weak and neurologically inhibited.
Yes.
And then the second part of her question was she was told that she had lazy rhomboids with adhesions.
Yeah.
And she was saying, oh, I thought adhesions only happened in tight muscles.
Or in muscles that had been traumatized and she hadn't had
She
an
said trauma.
injury.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So the broader sense of adhesion where it's one thing stuck to another. So possibly there was adhesions, fibrous adhesions built up maybe between lower traps and rhomboids.
Yeah. So the initial therapist who gave her this advice had probably evaluated it reasonably accurately, but had used terminology that didn't enlighten the client as to what they were supposed to do.
Yeah.
But what I thought was funny was then the comments then, that it kind of demonstrated that once you start to stray from precise language, people come up with all kinds of weird interpretations. You know, people were saying stuff like that, uh, oh yeah, what they mean is your rhomboids are weak. And I was going, oh great, point for you. And then they said, so you should stretch them. And I was like,
Yeah.
how is stretching a weak muscle going to help it tonify? So really the first point would be always to address the underlying cause. Stretch the tight muscles in the front. And then strength train weak muscles like the rhomboids, doing shoulder retraction type exercises, using something like a resistance band, or if you're in the gym, using weights, like whatever you want to do.
Rowing
At
machine.
home, using bottles of water, anything that provides a bit of resistance that can help us to get a training effect. Positioning ourselves in such a way that gravity is actually helping us with that weight. So if you're using water bottles, it'd be almost like a bent over row type position. Um, so again, you'd a total misconstruing that, well, yeah, it's weak, therefore it should be strength trained.
Yeah.
And then them narrowly saying that these adhesions only happen as a result of surgery. You're like, no, fascial sheets are getting stuck together. Therefore, we need to unstick those. And there are techniques that really do that well.
Yeah.
You get phenomenal results with cupping in particular,
Yeah.
and some of the gua sha, the scraping.
Mm-hmm.
Myofascial technique to push the fascia back to a more neutral position. Soft tissue release, really one of our most powerful tools for helping to get rid of adhesion between different layers within the tissue.
Yeah. Even pin and stretch
Yeah.
works
So,
really well.
so understanding that if you have a clear idea of the nature of the dysfunction, you are then really well positioned to use the proper technique, tool, protocol, whatever way you want to put that, to correct for that dysfunction.
Absolutely.
So this is where I think language is important, that rather than saying that things are lazy, we would say that they are inhibited. You might say that they're weak,
Yes.
because some people would argue, well, to what degree are they inhibited? And you always see again these social media people losing their minds over people saying things like, you know, the muscle is switched off. And like, your muscle's always switched off and you're dead. And it's like, they don't mean completely.
Completely. Yeah.
You know, there's
Yeah.
always tone even in the weakest of muscles, unless there's absolute nerve damage and there isn't even trace contraction. There's usually some degree of tone.
Yeah.
So yeah, like I said, that comes back to the same point, precise language.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anything else? Some of the other comments that you noticed worth
They were
addressing?
kind of making the analogy with glutes, being told their glutes were lazy as well.
Yeah,
So just where we were talking about psoas, if psoas is tight, it can inhibit
yeah,
glutes, and they can become weak.
yeah. And the other thing that they were saying was adhesions only happen in tight muscles. So
Yeah.
that's not true. Weak muscles can become adhered as well.
Yeah. Locked to line.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's a lot of terminology. Like we normally talk about kind of opposite ends of the continuum, where we'd say some muscles are short, tight, and facilitated, and other muscles are overstretched, weak, and inhibited. But you do have grades within that. So a lot of muscles, like say the anterior compartment muscles, where people will be prone to shin splints, that's usually a dynamic compartment syndrome where the fascia is stuck in that lengthened position. And the shorthand we'd use is locked long. And then other muscles like posterior tibialis might be short, but they're not strong. So you could have a low arch, but you still have like a mid-range stuck posterior tibialis.
Yeah.
So while we might talk about these two extremes, there is a middle ground, certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And checking things, weight bearing and non-weight bearing.
Yes, how those appear differently as well when we're doing assessments, that you don't take any one assessment as being the tells you everything answer to all questions. You know, it is that one assessment checking somebody's posture standing versus lying on a table, non-weight bearing, versus doing active range of motion, passive range of motion, muscle resistance tests, special orthopedic tests. They all build up a more complete picture the more evaluating you do from as many perspectives as possible.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay, I think we're almost there. Anything else you wanted to comment on that?
Do your stretches.
Do your stretches is probably the key takeaway. And we would say try
Join
to
the
be precise in your language.
absolutely. Yeah.
Join.
If you can join us for that amazing seminar coming up in October, we're yet to reveal the special guest.
We'll be talking about it on our podcast fairly soon. We're finalizing details at this time, but it is going to be a great 3-day seminar, stretching, strengthening, and a lot of client self-care. We won't go into any more detail. We'll give things
too much away.
but definitely keep an eye on our website, hcd.ie. We'll be talking about it in our podcast, and I'm sure if you're following us at all on our social media, you'll see it appear there as well.
Yeah, excellent.
Great.
Great and exciting things to come.
Yes. So on that happy note, we'd like to thank you for watching this particular episode of CMTV. Be sure and subscribe. And if you want to help support the channel, you can always go onto our website, purchase some of our micro modules, our many books, or even just some of our merch. We would really appreciate that. Okay.
Until next time.
I think that's it for today. Thanks again for joining us, folks. And we hope to see you again soon.